Hello and welcome to another Ourdadsstamps video. A few months ago I joined a Facebook group about stamp collecting, and since joining I've been struck by the number of people who are asking for advice on valuations of the stamps and who really have no idea what they've got in front of them and how to go about it. So I thought I'd produce a video to try and help these people, and maybe you're one of those that have inherited a large collection and really don't know where to start. So this is trying to just make some sense of a collection, whether you're just starting out or even if you've been collecting for a while. Hopefully there are some tips here that might help. So if you've just inherited a collection, the first thing you should realise is that stamp collectors generally don't collect stamps to make a profit. They're not in it for the monetary value, they're in it for the pleasure and the enjoyment of looking at beautiful stamps and collecting sets, putting together what they consider a good collection. So unless you've got a really unusual collection, don't expect to have a fortune after trying to sell it. It probably won't happen. That's not to say there are not valuable collections out there, but by and large most people collect for the pleasure and for the fun. And there is a lot of fun and a lot of pleasure in it, so that's something to consider. These couple of pages are from my collection, and as you can see I've spent time putting them together, presenting them nicely. This was in an album of Queen Elizabeth Great Britain stamps, and to me they look nice. I've got complete sets of most of Queen Elizabeth stamps, or rather I did have. I've actually sold this set now. But I didn't collect them for monetary value. These aren't worth an awful lot of money at all. The reason I collected them was just for the pleasure of completing a set of British stamps. So that's something to bear in mind when you look at a collection. It's not automatically going to be worth loads of money just because it's a lot of stamps that have been put together. The second thing to consider is just because it's old doesn't mean it's valuable. There's an awful lot of old stamps out there, and an awful lot of these old stamps aren't worth much money. This stamp I'm showing you now is the very first stamp issued by Spain in 1851. So that stamp is 170 years old, but it actually catalogues at about £25, which means you could pick it up for less than a fiver. So for something that old, that's really not that great. But that's the way of the stamps. Millions of these were produced, so it stands to reason there's still an awful lot of them left in the world, and for that reason it's not going to be worth a lot of money. Even the famous penny black, there's millions of them. So it's a fabulous stamp and everybody wants one, and I've certainly got some, but it's not a hugely valuable stamp. And we'll have a look at penny blacks a bit later on, but yeah. Old stamps aren't necessarily valuable stamps. There are even some Victorian stamps that are worth tuppence. It's to do with the quantity that were produced. And the Victorians were avid letter writers, so a lot of Victorian stamps were issued, which means they're not always going to be worth a lot of money now. So what should we look for in a stamp collection? Well, for me, the first thing you should look at really is it organised? Is it just a load of stamps stuck in a book and left there, or have they been carefully sorted and carefully put in some sort of order and presented nicely? Again, there's a couple of examples here. This first one is just an accumulation of stamps. There is an album, but it's a very basic album. There's a lot of loose stamps that are still attached to paper, which means at some point someone's got to soak them off to be able to put them in an album. It needs sorting. However you sort your stamps, they can be sorted into various ways. I personally sort my stamps into country, and then within each country it's generally in chronological order as much as possible. Some people collect themes, so they might collect all stamps about aeroplanes, or they might collect all stamps about birds. I've even seen stamp collections presented by colour, which is an unusual way of doing it, but stamp collecting is a very personal thing, so you collect the way you want to collect. But whichever way you collect, they should be organised some way. So if the collection is not organised and it's just an accumulation of stamps, then chances are it's not going to be worth an awful lot of money. This lot is partially organised. It's a page of Australian stamps, and there is some sort of order to it. You can see that similar stamps have been put together, and someone has obviously thought about this when they put this together. Now, depending on how many pages there are like this, whether this is 1 page out of 100 or 1 page out of 10, will depend whether it's worth much money. I would guess if it's in an album of maybe 100 pages, you wouldn't get much more than £100 for it, if that. So once again, it shows that stamps are not generally worth lots of money, but they look nice. It would be what's called a nice starter collection. There's a good range of stamps there from Australia. There's some old ones, there's some newer ones, and it's something you could start to build on. This last one is a page from one of my albums, and it's a page of Ourdadsstamps. And as you can see, it's a full set of King George V stamps from 1934. They are mounted properly. They haven't been damaged in any way, and they're now protected. They're in order, and what's more is there's a couple of variations put on there. So a collection with pages like this in it is likely to be worth more money. Now, this particular set is actually only catalogued at £70. So value-wise, if you sold that, you may get £20 for it because of the presentation. But even ones like that, it's not hugely valuable. But it does, being well presented and protected, makes it more desirable, and more people are going to want to buy that. If you took that to a dealer as opposed to the previous page, the dealer's going to have a good look at those ones. Whereas on the previous pages, they probably wouldn't bother looking that far. And if you're starting a collection, it's worth you putting your collection in that sort of order so that it makes it look better for should you ever wish to sell in the future. One of the things that has often been said when people have asked what's the value of these stamps is, if you've got a lot of the same stamp, chances are it's not going to be worth a lot, because otherwise why would you have lots of them? However, that's not always true. This page, again, it's a page from my collection. On the face of it, they all look the same stamp, and there's just a whole load of them stuck on a page. But on closer inspection, you can see there's a number underneath each one. And this is actually a collection of what's called penny red plates. And each one of these has come from a different printing plate, and the numbers underneath refer to which plate that is. Now, we haven't got time here to see how I worked out the plates, and I have actually already done a video on this. But the fact that there is some numbers underneath it should indicate that it's more than just a whole load of the same stamps. And even if you don't know what the numbers mean, it's worth looking into a little bit further. This page, on the other hand, is a page of Ceylon stamps, and they are so common, I've got hundreds of them, and to be honest, I don't really know what to do with them. So when you see a collection like this, then the chances are those individual stamps are worth very, very little, if anything at all. The only thing it might be useful for is a specialist collector, and I've done this with Maltese stamps, is you accumulate hundreds of the same stamp, and then you look for tiny little imperfections or tiny little errors on these stamps, which do crop up, but it takes a lot of patience and a lot of looking, and generally is not actually worth that much more in terms of money, but it does give you satisfaction finding something different. Now we get on to the main thing about a stamp collection, and that is condition. The condition of the stamps is everything. You can have hugely valuable stamps, but if they're torn, if they're grubby, if they're creased, and all sorts of other things, they're really not going to be worth anywhere near as much as if they are in a good condition. I'm going to go through a few examples just so that you can see what a difference it makes, the condition, and also what to look out for. Good condition to a non-collector is very different from good condition to a stamp collector. So let's just have a look. On this page we've got 3 penny blacks, and you can see the first one on the left hand side, there are no margins to the stamp at all. Around the outside it's been cut right up against the black, and this is considered a no-no. When stamps were first issued, they hadn't invented any way to perforate the stamps, to separate the stamps. So they had to be cut out by hand by the post office clerk. Now, depending on the dexterity of the clerk, but also the conditions, don't forget, if it was late at night, these people were working by candles, so it's very, very difficult to see black edges in the dark when you've got a queue of 10 people in front of you waiting to buy stamps. So it's unusual to find a penny black with 4 good margins, and that are just little white spaces around the outside of the stamp. And those are the ones that people want, so those are the valuable ones. The one on the right has got 4 margins, and that would probably sell for around about £150. As I said, penny blacks are quite common, but they are still collectible and they're still valuable. So the really good one on the right, you could probably buy for around about £150, somewhere around about that. You might get it cheaper, you might well have to pay more for it. Whereas the poor one with no margins, you could probably pick that up for less than £50 because it's just not what people want. And in the middle, there's one in between, which has had some of the margins cut in at the top right-hand side and has a couple of small margins. So it's okay, but it's not as good as the one on the right. However, it's better than the one on the left. So the price you'd pay would be in between the price of the other two. So that's one of the things in terms of condition is the margins. Now that does only apply to really old Victorian era stamps, because by the 1850s they'd started to produce machines that could perforate the stamps, which made the whole business much easier. However, then we get on to the idea of centering, because the machines weren't always accurate, and sometimes they perforated it right at the edge of the stamp and the margins were on the other side. So again, although they're not being cut by hand, the machines weren't necessarily perfect in those days, and so you want to try and get hold of a stamp that has good centering with the perforations all the way round and a white edge between the stamp and the perforations. You also, whilst we're talking about perforations, you also want all the perforations to be intact and in good condition. If we look at this stamp here, and this is quite an unusual example actually, but if we look at this stamp here, this is a penny red plate. And at first glance, penny red plates are quite cheap generally, but it does depend on the plate number. And if you look at this stamp down the right hand side, it's actually been cut with scissors by the looks of it. On the left, the perforations are torn and ragged, and along the bottom they were also torn and ragged. So at first glance, this is quite a poor stamp. However, this is actually plate 225, which is the most valuable of the penny red plates. In perfect condition, this catalogue's at £700. In this condition, it's vastly reduced because of all the damages to it. It's hard to put a price on it because it depends what people will pay, but I wouldn't expect that to get much more than £100, to be honest. The condition is quite poor. But people will still want it because it fills a gap in their collection, and quite often people buy imperfect stamps to fill a gap until they can afford to buy a good condition stamp. So yes, this is one where the perforations have been damaged. It's under normal circumstances you wouldn't look at that stamp, but because this is a valuable stamp, then it's worth a second look, and it's still worth money. The same can be said about these £1 green stamps. Again, Victorian stamps. I've illustrated 2 on this page. The one on the left hand side is in excellent condition. It's got good perforations. It's quite well centred so that there are white margins all the way round. And also it's got quite a nice cancellation on it. It's right in the middle of the stamp. It still leaves enough of the picture to be able to see Queen Victoria's head and most of the design. So this is a very nice looking stamp. It's also got a very nice deep colour which adds to the appeal of this stamp. The catalogue value for this stamp is about £800. Now that one, in because it's in such a good condition, you're probably looking at £400 or £500 to buy. The second one is in very poor condition. It looks as though it's been rolled around in the mud on the ground. There's a chunk taken out of the top left corner, and although that's only a small bit, that will detract from the value of the stamp. It may be possible to clean that stamp up, but in its current state you're not looking at much. Whereas the other was £400–500, this is certainly less than 100, I would think, to buy that stamp. So as I say, once again, condition is all. This penny green is an example of poor centering. If you have a look, the perforations along the top edge almost cut into the stamp itself, leaving a big margin along the bottom. And this would certainly detract from the value of the stamp. Apart from that, it does look a very nice stamp and has nice colouring and nice cancellation to it. But the fact that it's off centre would take perhaps £100 off the value of the stamp. So that shows how the centering can affect values. The effect the condition has on the value of stamps is even more pronounced with the £1 lilac. The one on the left in excellent condition is catalogues at £3,500, and you'd be looking at least £2,000, £2,500 to buy this example. Whereas the one on the right is awful. There are so many cancellations on it, you really can't see anything. It's really grubby again, so you can barely see the Queen's head on the stamp at all. It doesn't look like there's any tears or any problems with the perforation, so in that respect it's not so bad. But as I said right at the beginning, most stamp collectors collect stamps because they look nice. This doesn't look nice. So although it's a £3,500 stamp, to get this stamp I would suggest you wouldn't pay much more than 100, maybe 150, because it's the valuable stamp. But I think I'd look elsewhere rather than spending £150 on this, even if it meant not having the stamp for a while. Just a couple of things whilst we're on condition. One is the colour. As you saw in the last two examples, because of the grubbiness of the stamps in poor condition, they didn't have such a nice colour as the other examples. Well, that can be even more exacerbated, particularly with later Queen Victoria, Edward VII and King George V stamps from British Commonwealth. They were printed in what was called fugitive inks. Now that was a security measure because what happened was when you soaked them in water, the colour lifted out as well, so it washed out the colour. This stopped people reusing the stamps, but it also meant when you were trying to get the stamps off the envelope to collect, you risked damaging them. And in this example of a straight settlement stamp, these are both Edward VII $2 stamps. One on the right, as you can see, has been washed and the colour is completely faded. And again, it doesn't look very nice at all. It's not an exceptionally valuable stamp. It catalogues at about £35 in the good state. So in the poor state, the one on the right, you wouldn't pay more than a couple of quid for it. It's just not worth it. You're better off waiting to get a nice example. But it may be useful just to fill a gap until you get one. Obviously, it shouldn't need to be said that any stamp that's got a big tear on it is not worth keeping. Unless, like one of these, it's a £3,000 stamp, then you might want to keep one that's been torn. It's hard to show torn stamps on this video, but my advice would be to keep clear of any stamps with a tear in it, particularly the lower value ones. They're just not worth it. There is also something called a thin. Now that generally comes about when people stuck stamps in their albums with hinges, and then when they remove the stamp weren't overly careful, the hinge rips some of the back of the stamp off. This again really detracts from the value of the stamp. And you can see this if you hold the stamps up into the light, it will see a lighter patch in the middle where the thin is. Again, this will severely affect the value of a stamp, so try and avoid those as well. And that's where you need to beware, because they can be hidden. If you stick another hinge over the top, this can sometimes disguise the fact that there's a thin there. Something to look out for, something to beware of. And from the other perspective, if you're removing hinges from your stamps, be careful. Some of the older hinges stuck quite heavily onto the stamp, so you need to be careful when removing them. One last thing to look out for is something called toning. and that is shown by brown marks around the edges of the stamp. Usually on the back of the stamp, but it can leach through to the front of the stamp and then obviously spoils the look of the stamp. There's a lot of people that won't touch stamps that have got toning on. There is a theory that it breeds spores that can spread to the other stamps in your collection. So it's something to avoid. This example is of a British Bechuanaland stamp. In good condition, it catalogues at about £250. In current condition, if you were willing to buy it, and as I said, a lot of people won't touch toned stamps. It hasn't been 100% proved that they spread the toning, but why take the chance? In its current state, you're probably looking at maybe a tenner, again, just to fill the gap. And there are products around that can remove toning, but they also contain an element of bleach or something similar which can affect the colour of the stamp. So whilst this could be improved, again, it's not really worth looking at unless you haven't got anything else. One very last thing I came across, and this is horrendous. However, unfortunately, it's not the first time I've seen this, and what I can't believe is this is currently for sale for $130 for a collection. As you can see from the picture, there's a brown mark on most of the stamps. This has been caused by the stamps being stuck onto the pages with sellotape. Now, with modern thinking, I cannot understand why anybody would use sellotape to put a stamp. Stamp hinges, which were in use from, I don't know when they started, but they've been around for at least 100 years, work perfectly well. They are immensely cheap to buy, probably cheaper than sellotape. So why would you stick a stamp in with a sellotape? Apart from the fact it stains the stamp, as you can see, and those stamps are now worthless. They are completely ruined. Getting them off the sellotape is also risky and can also damage the stamp. So if you see anything like this, steer well clear of it. Don't even touch it. And if it's part of your collection, then I hate to say this, but just stick it in the bin. It's not a nice look. Anyway, back to my original introduction. Stamp collectors generally collect stamps for the look, for the pleasure they get from looking at pieces of art, from the pleasure they get from completing a collection, from the pleasure they get from presenting it in a nice way. We generally don't collect stamps to make a lot of money. So when you inherit a collection, don't immediately think, how much money am I going to make from this? Think about the pleasure you can get from continuing it, from maybe adding to it, but certainly from the pleasure of just looking at it on a daily basis. Thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and we'll see you again in a few weeks' time.